In the mid-1990s, one journalist dared to trace the smoke back to the fire. His name was Gary Webb, an investigative reporter for the San Jose Mercury News, and what he uncovered would shake the very foundation of trust in the U.S. government. In a three-part exposé titled Dark Alliance, Webb alleged that the CIA helped facilitate the trafficking of crack cocaine into America's inner cities, most notably black neighborhoods during the 1980s. The profits from these drug sales were funneled to support a covert war in Nicaragua. While foreign rebels gained weapons, America's black communities were left devastated by addiction, incarceration, and structural collapse. This wasn't fiction. This was policy buried beneath layers of deniability and deception. The story begins in the fever pitch of the Cold War, a time when the U.S. was locked in a global chess match against the Soviet Union. For President Ronald Reagan, this wasn't just about politics. It was a moral crusade. He saw the spread of communism as the ultimate evil, and he was determined to stop it at any cost. In Nicaragua, the leftist Sandinista government had seized power, implementing socialist reforms and aligning itself with Cuba and the Soviet bloc. To Reagan, this was unacceptable. A Marxist government in America's own backyard was a threat he believed could not be tolerated. So his administration threw its support behind a counter-revolutionary army, the Contras, a coalition of right-wing rebels seeking to overthrow the Sandinistas. But there was a legal roadblock. Congress passed the Bolin Amendment, explicitly prohibiting U.S. funding of the Contras. Instead of respecting this democratic check, Reagan's administration sought covert and illegal means to continue the fight, ways that wouldn't require public or congressional approval. This is where the shadowy corridors of power intersected with the streets of America. While Reagan was publicly championing a war on drugs, complete with Nancy Reagan's now famous Just Say No campaign, the U.S. government was quietly enabling one of the most devastating drug epidemics in American history. Under the cover of Cold War strategy, the CIA turned a blind eye and in some cases allegedly facilitated the import of cocaine into the United States. The proceeds funneled to arm and supply the Contras. The contradiction was staggering. On television, Reagan demonized drug dealers and addicts, disproportionately portraying them as dangerous black criminals. His administration pushed for mandatory minimums, 3 strikes laws, and sentencing disparities that punished crack cocaine, most prevalent in poor black communities, 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine, which was more common in wealthier, whiter circles. Yet behind closed doors, his own government was complicit in unleashing the very drug they claimed to be waging war against, and they funneled it directly into black neighborhoods. This wasn't an accident, it was a calculated trade-off. Winning the Cold War was Reagan's highest priority, and if that meant turning South Central Los Angeles, Harlem, and countless other black communities into battlegrounds of addiction, violence, and mass incarceration, so be it. The war on communism was seen as noble. The war on drugs was sold as moral, but in the shadows, Black America became collateral damage in a war it didn't ask for and never consented to. This is where the story takes a dark and tragic turn, not just of foreign policy gone rogue, but of a government willing to sacrifice its own marginalized citizens to win a war overseas while lying to their faces at home, and the costs still being paid today. As the Reagan administration funneled support to the Nicaraguan Contras through backdoor operations, a dark alliance formed between Contra-affiliated drug traffickers and covert U.S. operatives. These traffickers began smuggling enormous shipments of cocaine into the United States with little interference from the very agencies tasked with stopping them. The gateway was South Central Los Angeles, a predominantly Black and economically marginalized community already struggling under the weight of redlining, job discrimination, and the gutting of public services. In this neglected landscape, the influx of cheap cocaine created both a market and a tragedy. Cocaine in its powdered form was already popular among elites, but what happened next weaponized the drug for devastation. The powdered cocaine was chemically cooked into crack, a smokable, highly addictive form that was far cheaper to produce and distribute. Its small size and intense high made it easy to sell and even easier to get hooked on. Rick Ross, a young and ambitious black man from South Central who would go on to become one of the most prolific drug dealers of the 1980s. Ross built an empire. unknowingly at the center of a global intelligence web. He purchased his product from Nicaraguan traffickers tied to the Contras, men who operated with stunning impunity, often shielded from prosecution thanks to their ties to the CIA. Ross moved hundreds of millions of dollars worth of crack, saturating not just L.A., but entire regions of the country. Once crack took root in Los Angeles, it spread like wildfire. Through highways, gang networks, and decentralized trafficking routes, crack found its way to Oakland, Chicago, Miami, New York, Baltimore, Detroit, Atlanta, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. What began as a localized epidemic rapidly became a nationwide public health crisis, with poor Black communities bearing the full brunt. But this wasn't just a drug problem. It was a systemic collapse orchestrated in part by a government more concerned with geopolitical dominance than the lives of its own citizens. As these traffickers earned profits and funneled the money back to fund the Contra War in Nicaragua, entire Black neighborhoods in the U.S. were turned into zones of despair. Families were ripped apart by addiction. Violent crime surged, fueled by turf wars and desperation. The media ran racist narratives of the crack baby, the welfare queen, and the super predator, demonizing the very people who had been victimized. And worst of all, federal lawmakers responded not with compassion or reform, but with draconian laws that targeted crack users with severe mandatory minimum sentences, even as powder cocaine, favored by white and wealthy users, carried far lighter penalties. The irony was cruel. While politicians preached morality through the Just Say No campaign and flooded the airwaves with anti-drug propaganda, the U.S. government stood silently complicit in unleashing the substance that would tear through America's Black communities with surgical precision. What began with a covert operation in Latin America metastasized into a national epidemic, destroying lives, incarcerating millions, and leaving behind a legacy of trauma, distrust, and systemic disenfranchisement that persists to this day. This wasn't just a story of one man or one city. It was the intentional poisoning of a people, all to win a war that most Americans never even knew was being fought. The spread of crack cocaine was not merely a public health crisis. It was a social detonation, a seismic rupture whose shockwaves transformed Black America. And despite public officials claiming neutrality in the so-called war on drugs, its target was deliberate and its impact was devastating. In 1986, amid growing panic over crack cocaine, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. The law introduced mandatory minimum sentencing and codified a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. That meant possessing just 5 grams of crack, often sold in impoverished neighborhoods, triggered the same sentence as 500 grams of powder cocaine, typically found in wealthier white communities. Even though crack and powder are chemically identical, the law created a 2-tier justice system. Black Americans, especially men, were arrested, convicted, and sentenced at vastly disproportionate rates. By 1995, although Black people made up 13% of the U.S. population, they comprised nearly 60% of those imprisoned for drug offenses. Entire families were torn apart, with mothers and fathers serving decades behind bars for low-level nonviolent offenses. Children were raised without parents, often funneled into under-resourced foster systems or left in the care of overburdened relatives. The prison industrial complex exploded. Incarceration became not just a consequence of crime, but a policy solution to a government-engineered crisis. The war on drugs transformed Black neighborhoods into occupied territories. Fueled by federal funding and political pressure to appear tough on crime, police departments nationwide began to militarize. Tactical gear, battering rams, armored vehicles, and automatic rifles became standard for urban drug raids. SWAT teams, once rare, now stormed homes in pre-dawn raids for minor infractions. Stop and frisk policies and aggressive surveillance tactics became normalized, turning Black communities into open-air prisons. The message was clear: these neighborhoods were not to be protected. They were to be contained and controlled. Trust between black citizens and law enforcement disintegrated. A child playing outside or a teen walking home could be stopped, searched, even shot because suspicion became policy. The system no longer saw residents as victims of a drug epidemic. Instead, they were painted as the enemy in a war crafted far from their streets, in Washington boardrooms and CIA back channels. The crack epidemic didn't just destroy individual lives, it dismantled entire ecosystems within black communities. Addiction rates skyrocketed, with crack's cheap cost and fast high making it deeply accessible in neighborhoods already suffering from poverty and hopelessness. Local economies imploded as jobs disappeared due to deindustrialization and disinvestment. The drug trade filled the void, but it brought chaos, not prosperity. Violence surged, not because of inherent criminality, but due to the black market competition, over-policing, and desperation that accompanied the drug spread. Public schools deteriorated as property tax bases shrank and funding dried up. Children growing up in crack-ravaged neighborhoods faced trauma at home, chaos in their communities, and neglect from the institutions that were supposed to serve them. Mental health crises exploded, unacknowledged, untreated, and often criminalized instead of addressed through care. By the early 1990s, the crack epidemic had institutionalized poverty, criminalized blackness, and normalized generational trauma. It became a cycle. Addiction bred arrests. Arrests bred broken families bred instability, and instability bred further addiction and violence. This was not the natural course of urban decay. It was engineered collapse, a consequence of foreign policy choices, racialized fear-mongering, and systemic neglect. Black America didn't just suffer a crisis, it suffered an orchestrated catastrophe with decades-long consequences. And while the headlines shifted and the politicians moved on, black communities never got the truth, the justice, or the reparative care they were owed. The echoes of the crack era still shape housing, policing, education, and health today. The damage wasn't accidental, it was the price of silence, sacrifice, and state-sanctioned survivalism. Gary Webb paid the ultimate price for exposing an uncomfortable truth. In 1996, his explosive investigative series Dark Alliance shook the foundations of trust in the U.S. government and the media. Published in the San Jose Mercury News, the series laid out a chilling narrative. Drug traffickers with ties to the CIA had funneled cocaine into America's inner cities, particularly black communities, to fund the U.S.-backed Contra War in Nicaragua. It was a direct link between foreign policy and domestic devastation, and for the first time, someone had put names, faces, and documents to the story. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Webb's reporting spread like wildfire across black communities, talk radio, and grassroots circles, where the government's neglect and targeting of black neighborhoods were already deeply felt. But instead of sparking a national reckoning or an official investigation, Webb's revelations were met with a coordinated backlash, not from the government alone, but from the very institutions meant to hold power accountable, the mainstream press. Major outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times didn't launch investigations into the CIA's role. They launched full-scale assaults on Webb's credibility. In a rare display of unity, these papers combed through his work looking not for the truth, but for flaws, inconsistencies, or anything that could be used to discredit his findings. The Los Angeles Times famously assigned a team of 17 reporters to dismantle Dark Alliance, not because the claims had been proven false, but because they threatened the status quo. Under immense professional and personal pressure, including the withdrawal of support from his own editors, Webb was pushed out of journalism's mainstream. He resigned from the Mercury News and was effectively blacklisted. His once promising career disintegrated. He struggled financially, took lower-profile reporting jobs, and battled the stigma of being labeled a conspiracy theorist. In December 2004, Webb was found dead in his California home with 2 gunshot wounds to the head, ruled a suicide. The gruesome nature of his death sparked further controversy, but the official ruling stood. Years after his death, declassified CIA documents and the agency's own Inspector General reports confirmed key aspects of Webb's reporting. The CIA had been aware of contra-connected traffickers moving cocaine into the U.S. and chose not to stop them. Yet, the damage to Webb's name had already been done, and mainstream rehabilitation of his legacy has been halting, reluctant, and incomplete. In the end, Gary Webb didn't just tell a dangerous story. He told the truth that too many powerful institutions were unwilling to face. Rather than confront the implications of his work, they destroyed the man who dared to connect the dots. While government agencies waged war abroad and the media claimed objectivity at home, one journalist stood between both and was buried under the weight of silence, complicity, and shame. Today, Webb is recognized by many as a martyr of modern investigative journalism, a man who gave his life to reveal the hidden cost of empire. The legacy of the U.S. government's covert alliance with drug traffickers in the 1980s is not a closed chapter. It is a wound that continues to bleed into the present. The aftershocks of that betrayal ripple through Black America to this day, shaping not just individual lives, but entire systems, cities, and worldviews. The crack epidemic left more than bodies and broken homes. It left behind deep psychological scars that span generations. Children who grew up in the 1980s and 90s watched their parents become addicted, arrested, or lost to violence. Many were raised in unstable environments, cycling between foster care, group homes, or relatives barely holding on themselves. Emotional neglect, abandonment, and community-wide grief became normalized. The trauma was not just individual, it was collective, woven into the social fabric of entire neighborhoods. Today, that trauma manifests as chronic mental health struggles, mistrust of authority, and generational patterns of instability. It is passed down not by choice, but by circumstance, rooted in a time when survival was prioritized over healing. Though the crack era is often spoken about in the past tense, its policies remain alarmingly present. The mandatory minimum sentences introduced in the 1980s still haunt our criminal justice system. While some reforms have narrowed the crack-to-powder cocaine sentencing disparity, they have not eliminated it, and countless individuals continue to serve disproportionately long sentences for nonviolent drug offenses committed decades ago. Beyond incarceration, the criminalization of poverty through broken windows policing, cash bail systems, and aggressive fines and fees continues to target poor Black communities. Addiction is still often punished instead of treated, and Black Americans are still more likely to be stopped, searched, and prosecuted, despite using drugs at rates similar to white Americans. The war on drugs didn't end. It simply evolved into new policies that carry the same racialized impact. In the aftermath of the crack epidemic, many Black neighborhoods were neglected, underfunded, and written off as lost causes. Property values plummeted, services disappeared, and entire communities were allowed to rot, victims not only of drugs, but of intentional disinvestment by city and state governments. But once the chaos subsided and the land became profitable again, these same neighborhoods were reimagined, not for those who endured the suffering, but for wealthier, often white newcomers. Gentrification swept through cities like D.C., Oakland, Brooklyn, and Atlanta, replacing corner stores with cafes and pricing out the very residents who had survived the storm. It was a second betrayal, first targeted with drugs, then discarded, and finally displaced. A cycle of extraction and erasure that turned Black pain into white profit. Perhaps one of the most enduring impacts is the profound mistrust Black Americans have toward government institutions, and rightfully so. The idea that the U.S. government would tolerate or even facilitate the flooding of Black communities with narcotics to fund a foreign war isn't just disturbing. It's confirmation of a long pattern of state-sanctioned abuse. From the Tuskegee syphilis study to COINTELPRO, and now to the CIA Contra cocaine connection, Black Americans have historical evidence that their lives have been deemed expendable in service of broader national agendas. This legacy fuels a healthy skepticism toward policies, politicians, and public health messaging to this day. It's not paranoia, it's lived experience. The war that began in the jungles of Nicaragua didn't stay there. It came home, quietly, covertly, and with catastrophic precision, Its weapons were drugs, laws, and silence. Its victims, millions of Black Americans caught in a web of lies they didn't spin, in a war they never asked to fight. The echoes still resound in our prisons, our neighborhoods, our headlines, and our hearts. And until truth and justice are not just acknowledged but acted upon, this story remains unfinished. Gary Webb didn't just write a story, he ripped the veil off one of the most insidious betrayals in American history. Dark Alliance wasn't sensationalism, it was revelation. And more than that, it was indictment, a direct challenge to the moral facade of a nation that has long sacrificed Black lives for white political power and imperial ambition. His reporting dared to ask a question that still haunts this country. What kind of government funds a foreign war by poisoning its own citizens? And more specifically, what kind of government poisons Black communities, then criminalizes their survival? This didn't happen in a vacuum. The crack epidemic didn't spiral out of control. It was unleashed. It was allowed to spread, fester, and destroy because the lives it consumed were Black, poor, and already deemed disposable. This was not simply a failure of policy. It was an act of white supremacy in practice. The Reagan administration's obsession with defeating communism was never colorblind. While it publicly waved the banner of freedom, it privately engineered one of the most devastating internal assaults on Black America since the era of Jim Crow. It weaponized addiction, legislated generational incarceration, and militarized policing in the name of foreign policy. But at its core, it upheld a racial caste system that has always treated Black suffering as collateral, or worse, irrelevant. When Gary Webb connected the dots, the media and political elite closed ranks to destroy him, not because he was wrong, but because he was right. And in being right, he forced America to confront a truth it refuses to reckon with. That racism is not just a relic of the past, it is a living architecture, one that has shaped laws, dictated policy, and determined whose lives matter. The real tragedy? Most of America still won't look in the mirror. The government never issued a formal apology. The justice system never offered restitution. The press, for the most part, never apologized for discrediting Webb. And the Black communities who bore the brunt of this war have still not received truth, justice, or repair. But Black America remembers, not just the crack or the crime or the sirens, but the betrayal, the disposability, the lies sold as patriotism, the violence sold as policy, the pain repackaged as criminality. The conspiracy wasn't hidden, it was televised, it was legislated, it was enforced, it lived in every pipe smoked, every child arrested, every mother buried under grief, and every cell locked shut. Dark Alliance was more than an exposé. It was a warning, a signal flare from the margins of empire, and America ignored it. And Black Americans paid the price. Now the nation stands at a crossroads. It cannot claim to value justice, equity, or democracy while ignoring the blood still drying in its own backyard. There must be a reckoning, not symbolic, not rhetorical, a structural national confrontation with the racist systems that made this possible, and a commitment to truth and repair, so this kind of atrocity can never be buried, excused, or repeated again, because silence is complicity, and America can no longer afford to look away.